Hi everyone, it's Dr. Wiebrecht here. We're going to jump into chapter 5. We're going to talk about bureaucracies and formal organizations a little bit more in depth. This chapter is very short, so it should not take us very long. So I just want you guys to sort of stick with me here as we move forward with this. All right, so society is organized with the mentality that it's going to get its job done, right? It does this through formal organizations and bureaucracies. The same system that can be very frustrating to a lot of us trying to understand bureaucracies and these kind of organizations can also be very impersonal. In the same breath, right? We rely on these kind of systems and institutions to exist in our society, right? Because they're for our personal welfare. They're going to help us fulfill our daily needs in a sense. In the same concept of it, right, the society that existed today is obviously not the same society that existed for our parents and our grandparents' generation. And it's surely not going to be the same society that exists for our children. So there's this idea that there's a rationalization of our society, which refers to a transformation in people's thinking and behavior over the past 150 years. And shifting that focus from personal relationships to efficiency and results. So we're going to talk a little bit about Karl Marx, who very much was attributed to this transformation to capitalism. And we're also going to talk about Max Weber, who disagreed with Marx, basically in reference to that Protestant theology that we had talked about before. So those two guys are going to be very important in this chapter. Now, as a result of rationality, formal organizations exist, right? So we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth here in this sense. So let's move forward here. In rationality, there's this acceptance of rules, right? Our efficiency and practical results are the best way for us to sort of approach human affairs. It's sort of that mentality, right? It's very characteristic of industrial societies. Historically, when we look at this, that traditional orientation to life is based on the idea that the past is sort of the best way to help guide us into the present, right? However, this orientation stands in the way of industrialization. So capitalism requires a shift in people's thinking away from the idea that this is the way we've always done it. So let's find the most efficient way to do it now is more the concept, right? Think about the places that exist, the businesses and the organizations. Is that not necessarily the concept, right? We want to find the most efficient way to do something. So those personal relationships that we once thought about are being replaced by very impersonal short-term contracts. You know, if you can't efficiently guide us in this, we'll find somebody that can. So that bottom line becomes that primary concern. Karl Marx said that the development of capitalism caused people to change their way of thinking, not the other way around. So because capitalism was so much more efficient, it produced the things in greater abundance. And thus it yielded very high profits for us. And people began to change their ideas and those concepts very quickly. Weber believed that religion, on the other hand, right, was very much important. Because here, he believed that religion held the key to understanding the development of capitalism. Okay? He noted that capitalism emerged first in predominantly Protestant countries, right? So that Protestant ethic and that spirit of capitalism that we had talked about sort of set that stage of those behaviors that were rooted in Protestantism and led to the development of capitalist activity and of course, the rationalization of society. So Weber argued that because of Calvinistic belief in predestination, people wanted to show that they were among the chosen of God, right? So financial success in life became a sign of God's approval. However, Weber argued, money was not to be spent on oneself. Rather, the investment of profits became an outlet for their excess money. while the success of those investments became a further sign of God's approval. So, sort of reaching into this a little bit more, capitalism demanded rationalization, right? This careful calculation of practical results. Very traditional way of doing things. If it's not efficient, it must be replaced, right? For what counts are the results at the end of the day. So no one has yet been able to sort of establish which view is correct in this sense. But very important nonetheless in everything that we talk about. Now, no one has yet been able to establish which view is correct, either in the same breath. So consequently, there are going to be two that continue to exist, sort of side by side within sociology. And these are formal organizations and bureaucracies. Okay? So, as we move forward with this stuff, I know it can be very easy and overwhelming to feel a little lost in this topic. So it's just very important that you guys sort of stick with me here as we sort of guide through this. All right, so I want you guys to sort of understand that there's there's a couple different terms I want us to become familiar with. The first one is we know that there are these outstanding traits that make three people have in common. That's a category. So what do I mean by category? Think about it. If somebody in this picture, right, they all have bald heads, right? That's a trait that sort of sticks out. We tend to categorize them. It doesn't necessarily make them a group, but a category. Think about it. If these people all share something, some type of trait, in a sense, that's a category. Something that they all share. Bald heads, maybe blue eyes, brown hair, that kind of thing, right? Now, in the same breath, groups that have a very deep impact on our actions and views and orientations and make us feel things and have a different perspective towards life, right? That's going to be a group, right? A group of individuals. Because they necessarily aren't going to share the same physical trait, but they're going to maybe share similar ideas, right? A group of individuals that all believe in, I don't know, getting tattoos. Or the idea that individuals all want to, I don't know, you have a group of friends, right? Not all of you are going to share the same things, but you might all have similar actions or groups, or even just, hey, I feel like I'm young and I'm able to move forward in life, that kind of thing. Okay? So understand the difference between a group and a category. Remember, category is the one in which you're going to have some identified trait. Now, in this picture, we're going to look at something called a primary group. A primary group is something like the family, right? It plays such an important part of who we are as people, right? Good or bad. So a small group like the family serves as a buffer a lot of times for a much larger group like society, right? Our families raise us. They try to keep us out of harm's way. They sort of guide us in that life in a sense, right? So that concept of the family is extremely important from the very moment you're born, because it's going to give us certain guidance as to how we're going to turn out in life, right? Things we believe, things that we're going to do, all those types of things. So a primary group, again, is something that's much smaller, but plays a much larger role in our development of ourself. Right? And so here is that picture of that family. So sort of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, there's something called secondary groups. These are much larger and more anonymous, right? More formal in a sense and very impersonal than primary groups. Primary groups you're going to know, right? Your family. You're going to know whoever's raising you in that sense. Secondary groups, right? Look at the picture here, are images of maybe being in a cyclist group. Maybe you go to yoga and you meet lots of people, right? You're sharing something in this sense, some type of interest. Maybe there's something that's pulling you all there, right? You might not know everybody in that group. Think about it. When you go to like a camp, like a sport camp, you obviously have something that's pulling you all into that particular area, that particular field at that moment. But you might not know everybody there. You might know a handful of them. Now, by the end of this, these individuals might eventually move into your primary group. They might become very close friends of yours. Maybe one in which is going to be your best friend, right? These are individuals that at times might transform from a secondary group into a primary group. But that doesn't mean everybody is in that sense. Okay, this one is an aggregate. Aggregates are people who happen to be in the same place at the same time. Think about it. When we all used to be able to get out and go to the mall at one point in time, or you go to a store, right? You're all there. You're all sort of hanging out in some general space. Maybe you're looking at clothes on the rack, or maybe you're all at a football game or something, right? These are aggregates because these are all people in the same place and at the same time for whatever reason. Hoping that makes all sense to everybody. Okay. So, understand that formal organizations, right, are going to be very important to us as we sort of move forward in this, right? These are a lot of times something in which can be secondary groups that are designed to achieve maybe very specific objectives, right? Because they have become a very central feature of your contemporary life. Like, hey, I want to graduate. So you're hanging out, in a sense, right, with secondary groups. Maybe you're not best friends with everybody in your grade, right? But you all share something in this. You're all attempting to graduate. So early examples of formal organizations were like guilds and the army, right? As industrialization began to happen, these secondary groups became more common. So formal organizations, especially like those, they began to increase in size. And we eventually developed something called bureaucracies. Okay. Do you remember back in the day, maybe you used to watch movies where people would have like these good old boy kind of clubs that happened? We're going to talk about that a little bit more here down the road. But sort of keep with this idea that we have built these ideas of these organizations and these groups in a sense, and they sort of evolved over time as to what we see today. Now, Max Weber identified that there are essential characteristics of bureaucracies. And we're going to get to some of those here soon. But I want us to look at something that's very important. Okay. We have things, right? Look at this cartoon. How our participation in social groups shapes our self-concept is a focus of symbolic interactionists. In this process, knowing who we are not is as significant as knowing as who we are. So look at the cartoon. So long, Bill. This is my club. You can't come in. Right? Remember back in the day, there used to be places. If you watch any of the older movies, you'll see that there are certain societies, certain groups, right, that individuals were allowed to access and other ones weren't, in a sense. So these ideas sort of plays into something called in and out groups, right? So what groups do you guys identify with? You know, are there certain kinds of groups that you're like, I really am not a fan of. This is just something that I'm just not connecting with at any point in time. We all have in-groups, right? We all have this sort of concept of groups which we feel loyalty to, in a sense, and groups in which we outgroups, where we maybe feel some type of antagonism with it. We'll talk about the Crips and the Bloods a little bit in chapter 6. But think about it. If you're part of one of those groups, more than likely you're not going to identify with the other one, right? We make a lot of times some fundamental division in our lives that says, okay, this is who I belong with. These are the things that I believe in, that kind of thing. So again, in groups, we feel that loyalty. They sort of shape our perception of right and wrong. That's that us mentality. That out group on the other side is where we begin to feel that antagonism, that them mentality, right? We know that that sense of belonging is so important to a group. We talked about that with Durkheim and suicide rates, right? It can bring very positive consequences when we belong to a particular group. We feel that connectiveness in it, that maybe people love us and that we encourage them for us to do better, right? On the flip side, we know that there's a part of it where sometimes there's that division in the world, that us versus them mentality, right? It can at times lead to things like discrimination and hatred a lot of times, because it's this division that can extend to harming other people. And look at the example of the Nazis, right? They provide us with one of those most poignant kind of example, because the Jews were an outgroup who sort of symbolized an evil in that sense, in their mindset, that should be eliminated. So many ordinary, good Germans drank that Kool-Aid and believed, in a sense, right, that, oh, okay, we need to defend the Holocaust, we need to, as dirty work, and that someone has to do it within that sense, right? Yes, it's an example back then, but I'm sure you guys can think of current examples of that in group versus out group, that us versus them mentality. Think about after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, right? Al-Qaeda became Americans' #1 outgroup, right? So much so that U.S. top officials concluded that being cruel and inhumane and degrading to Al-Qaeda prisoners was not torture, right? So those officials had one Al-Qaeda leader that was waterboarded 180 times. Sort of caught up in a lot of this stuff, we began to justify very cruel and unusual behavior as humans in a whole, right? Because we can see how quickly that us versus that them mentality, that in-group and out-group kind of concept became so severe again that good people were supporting things that they might not have otherwise, right? We didn't really get to watch it because we moved so quickly through some things. But Rwanda, genocide, right? There's this idea that very good people that used to be your neighbors all of a sudden were chasing other people with machetes and killing them brutally because of this idea that they were different. So what does this mean? The world sometimes divides us into these in and out groups. It's a natural part of our social life. And of course, it can produce both functional and dysfunctional consequences in a whole when we look at it from a sociological review. All right. I want to talk a little bit about reference groups. And I want to also circle back to something called voluntary associations, which we'll get to here shortly. But first, let's talk about reference groups. So reference groups are something in which, right, the groups that we refer to when we evaluate ourselves. So your reference group may include your family, your neighbors, your teachers, your classmates, maybe even coworkers in a sense. Maybe people that are in the same church as you, synagogue or mosque, right? These are all parts of your reference group. So even a group you don't belong to could necessarily be a reference group. Think about if you're thinking about going to graduate school down the road. Graduate students or members of that profession may want to join, may form like a reference group. You may consider certain standards as you want to evaluate your grades or your writing skills in a sense. So reference groups are very important because they influence us and who we are. One day you might want to become a corporate executive or the director or something, right? So you're going to start to dress a certain way, maybe act a certain way, talk a certain way in a sense. You might change your major along the way, that kind of thing. At the same point, maybe you decide you're going to let go of everything else